Good evening, dear viewers, and a very warm welcome to today's Visite show, and I'm glad you're back. And I brought one, maybe two requests with me, and I'd like to discuss the first with you. A patient who complains that she has an incredible amount of belly fat, and she has developed type 2 diabetes and asks, how can it be that this insulin resistance, as it's called today, insulin resistance diabetes could develop as a result? And I would like to take this as an opportunity to explain a little bit about the background and also the pathology, but also the danger of too much abdominal fat to you. In the end, we live in an affluent society. And in the end, it's all homemade, own problems, which maybe could have been clarified much earlier. Humans are dependent on having some protection from their fat. And it used to be thought that fat alone was responsible for protection against the climate, against heat, against cold, against resistance, also through a certain layer of fat. And it is given to protect us. But the fat itself in us, it is also one of the main suppliers of energy in times of need. So the body is well served if it has a certain good protective layer of fat which is just subcutaneously under the skin. And this layer of fat is of enormous importance for us humans. This means that fat also belongs in the daily diet. Our entire nervous system needs an incredible amount of fat. And when I say fat, I mean good fats. So omega-3, oils, linseed oil, rapeseed, but also coconut and fish oil, olive oil and omega-9. These are all high-quality oils we need. But this visceral fat that develops when I have an increasing waist size, that is only intended for a specific area and not a super dimension where you sometimes see that people really have this big body as an apple type or as a pear type. Especially the apple type who has a large waist. And there are measurements for us women, that's 88 centimetres. Now that depends a bit on how tall we are. But a man over 102 centimetres would mean that the visceral abdominal fat occupies an enormous proportion in our body. And that does something to us. So sometimes I think to myself, if as women we have such a very strong belly, they often complain and then they no longer feel beautiful. We have to clarify that for ourselves, and we have to clarify that early on, because belly fat is what actually grows the fastest, because it's the energy reserve. It's just evolutionary design that way. You'll see that when you get a bit carried away, but also have little movement. It's actually the first thing that the belly fat is more, but that was a good thing because it could then be quickly available as an energy supplier. And the belly fat then actually breaks down again quickly. If you lead the body into a completely different metabolic economy by changing your behaviour, changing your diet, and of course becoming more activate and moving more. And all of this has to come together so that the body gets rid of this extreme belly fat. Of course, also due to a lack of exercise. That's one thing. But it is also possible, for example, due to an underactive thyroid gland, because the metabolic situation then gets into a very sluggish mechanism and causes overweight. Also due to estrogen dominance, so forming too much female hormones or not sufficiently breaking down the hormones, the estrogen. It has to be formed and broken down again and again. Another cause of this problem is the high sugar consumption, because the body actually does not do anything with the overconsumption of sugar at all. So it can only take the chance to convert this overconsumption of sugar. The liver now stores it as glycogen reserves, but also abdominal fat and fat cells. They can have up to 20 times the volume of healthy cells. And this abdominal fat, as I said, is then available very quickly. If we humans get stressed, then of course we also have a different neuroendocrine situation. That means when we get stressed, we demand stress hormones. And there is a long, long time when the body can also provide us with these stress hormones. And then we sometimes get hypercortisolism. That is, we have too much. We constantly release too much cortisol. That's not good either, because this too much cortisol also activates other mechanisms. And you know that in people who develop a so-called Cushing's syndrome, because they get high doses of cortisone, then they also develop such a trunk obesity. Arms, legs remain narrow, but the face can change like a moon face with this too much cortisone. And that's why, of course, when you say, I don't understand why I'm gaining so much weight, you have to investigate all these questions. But the bottom line is, and this is the main cause of too much belly fat, if you, of course, have a lack, real poverty of exercise. People used to be on the go for at least 6 to 8 hours. They had to put in a lot of effort to get anything to eat at all. And then, firstly, meals were not 3 times a day and usual, but once every few days. This is already well thought out by evolution to quickly create these reserves in your own body again and again, so that they can be used again tomorrow. But I want to come back to the danger of this belly fat. One thing is that the cell, this fat cell, ultimately also has a certain, I would say, size. I've got some numbers here again. The weight is 0.3 to 0.9 micrograms. And these fat cells produce leptin and adiponectin, which, by the way, can also be measured. And that is very important, because these hormones produced by the fat cells then, of course, also control our appetite, increase our level of hunger, or control our satisfaction with it. And they also coordinate carbohydrate and fat metabolism. Because with the whole question, no matter what develops, it is crucial that a cell is also supplied with nutrients, and all our cells, whether that is the brain cells, whether it is the stomach cell or the heart or the muscle cell, need energy to have a healthy cell metabolism. And they have to produce this energy themselves. And of course, for that, they need sugar and insulin. And that insulin, that hormone, that's needed. And that the pancreas makes available to us has also limited availability. This means that insulin as a hormone is very important for vitamins and minerals to be taken into the cell. It is very important for cell division metabolism. Insulin is one of the most important hormones for the salt and water balance, and for our cognitive performance, because the insulin is able to transport the sugar and then introduce it into the cell. That means I don't have an insulin deficiency now, but I have a defect in the cell. That means insulin has to dock there. A door has to be unlocked. The transporter has to be activated, which now takes the sugar molecule and transfers it into the cell. And sugar is the quick source of energy. Example, I have a house and I'm expecting guests. However, nobody of the family is there, and I'm in the basement now working with the hammer drill. And now the guests come outside and ring, and because nobody is in the house, the door is closed and I can't hear it because I'm in the basement. That should only clarify there is a constant sugar and insulin supply, and somehow that door stays locked. This means that retrospectively, the cell has to make do without sugar and energy. This emanates massively from these fat cells, because these fat cells actually produce this adiponectin to help us caringly. But when the fat cell becomes oversized, then this transport system no longer works, so that the insulin or sugar can get into the cell. The large cell produces less of this adiponectin, so the stimulator, the signal, is lost. The other thing is that it increasingly produces inflammatory mediators. That is the TNF-alpha. And this TNF-alpha, that's an inflammatory modulator, which in turn inhibits this gluK4. That is this transporter. That means I have a double negative consequence for my carrier function to get the sugar into the cell. And that's dramatic. The other thing is that due to this so-called TNF-alpha, a permanent inflammation of the cell takes place, to which in turn scavenger cells react. Scavenger cells want to recognise everything, what is wrong here, who is responsible for this inflammation, and so that the scavenger cells are activated to create an imbalance here. And they partially destroy these docking points, this keyhole where actually insulin has to intervene as a key. And today it is not medically relativized in any way that mitochondriopathies, that's what diseases are called when the cell metabolism becomes tired, that they are due to insulin resistance. That means there is enough sugar, but it cannot get into the cell, and that happens in a pretty also generalized extent then with time. What is a liver supposed to do if too much sugar is not processed in the body? If the excess sugar cannot get into the cell, then the metabolism parks it between by converting the liver cells in the liver into so-called connective tissue cells, popularly known as fat cells. But they are connective tissue cells, which are, of course, not available to the liver. A proportion of fatty liver is to be taken seriously, because the liver has a central task for our entire organism. And I used to always say 500 tasks. I have to correct myself there. There are far more than 500 tasks. And at the moment when the liver slacks in its capacity, nothing else gets better because everyone else has to accept that. The liver regulates, controls, and is essential as a superordinate organ for our blood circulation, our immune system, our hormone system, our stress metabolism, and can no longer serve well in this regard. That's why it's so incredibly important to have a homemade insulin resistance is taken seriously. And you can run away from insulin resistance. This means that you, of course, first have to reduce the needs of your body, that this chronic inflammatory process must be recognized, and that you reduce carbohydrates, and that is sugar. And always be aware whether I now eat noodles, pasta, bread, rice, potatoes, it ends up appearing in the blood as glucose. And the glucose needs the insulin. Insulin must be sure that it is not overwhelmed with the performance, but can also dock the cell temporarily. Otherwise, the sugar will not be processed further. Now, when I say sugar, I don't just mean carbohydrates in the sense of rice and pasta and cereals and potatoes. What I really mean are these many, many hidden sugars. And if you think you need bread in the morning and then a croissant, and then a sufficient pasta meal at lunchtime, and in the afternoon a piece of cake, and then again and again a snack and a kebab here and something sweet there, and Haribo, that's an immense attack on a metabolic process, which is really not dependent on it from an evolutionary point of view. And the most beautiful statement again and again is actually the minimalism. A little abstinence of things. You also lose desire of these sweet things, which also rob you of a lot of energy. Although they give you energy quickly, but ultimately make us tired, because then we always get hypoglycemia because so much insulin is needed that quickly moves this sugar into the cells. But the system that has hypoglycemia cries out for new sugar that is fundamentally dangerous. And if you just make some rules for yourself every day, by just not being so sluggish anymore, and from the point of view of an experienced adult, and in the wisdom of a grown-up person, but don't lose the childlike enthusiasm nor lose the urge to move. I don't want to order you to do any specific sport. Find what makes you happy. But your system, which sometimes wants to be challenged, immediately uses these energy reserves and dissipates them. Intermediate fasting. Just identify a meal that you could do without. And really it's just, and that's where you always start. Let go of what is actually not necessary. Those sweet drinks that you love, or I can't imagine when someone drinks Coke. I always think word has gotten around for a long time that a large bottle of Coke represents 70 sugar cubes. So when are we going to wake up? As a young person, am I aware of where I'm slowly running to? But I can't burn valuable health reserves for nothing. And those are things that are quite common for being overweight and in development as well. Of dementia, of diabetes, of rheumatic disease, all these diseases of civilization that are a lot of insulin resistance disorders. And you can detect insulin resistance. One can thus detect a pre-diabetic development early. But the fact is, it's always homemade, and the recovery of that body from all that excessive burden will not only give you a healthy well-being, and a normal weight, and again in the long term a strong and good physique that presents a healthy relationship of muscle fat mass as well, but will reduce the overactivity of a constant immune readiness, because the system saves inflammation, and you must provide your immune capacity for that. But it also has tasks every day to recognise viruses that want to reactivate. Turn off tumour cells, turn off bacterial loads. And with that, you actually overwhelm your own options. And that can only happen somewhere at the end. They say diabetes takes about 15 years. I honestly have to say, I'm 62 now. I wouldn't want to have something like that. And you have to have a little early in mind, what do I want tomorrow? And so we humans do well to understand that illness, no matter what it is called, is never a state, but a process that the body laboriously wants to find in its own, let's say, partial exhaustion from not being able to correct it anymore. And that health is not so much a condition, but rather an attitude, which thrives when you enjoy life. And if you enjoy life, you also have love for yourself and love for others. That's not a sentence from me, but from Thomas Aquinas. But I just find it so beautiful, and you are committed to yourself and important to yourself, and that has nothing to do with selfishness. But it is important that you have the power, the dynamics, the mental freshness and the mobility to live in one phase of life for which you prepared before, and not only when the horse has bolted, and even then it is declining. So it is now presumptuous to say that it is insulin resistance, and we now give only insulin, which I don't understand at all, because how does the insulin get into the cell when the insulin resistance is there? There we have pre-programmed side effects. I would always have a bit of respect for that, and it's actually always my way to get people out of there, to show them the way to get out of there, but that they have to get involved and maybe do things that they were not really aware of beforehand. And I have to tell you, life isn't any less beautiful because of it. On the contrary, it is incredibly enjoyable to be able to rely on yourself every day, but it needs the care of ourselves. On that note, thank you very much for listening, for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the next Sunday. And I usually say, have a nice evening, but maybe I'll just say good night. See you soon.